This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at numberfire.com, and this is episode 345 of the Late Round Podcast, one of the many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. Now that the Super Bowl's over, which congrats to all of you Chiefs fans out there, by the way, but now that the Super Bowl is done, we're officially in the offseason. And for all you dynasty nerds out there, that means it's peak time to start making moves. And that means it's peak time for me to give you some advice on the moves that you should be making. On today's show, I'm going to run through a handful of players that you should look to buy in dynasty leagues right now. Next week, I'm going to go over players to sell. Before doing that, though, even though football is over, Numberfire is still doing analysis for the other major sports that are still playing. If you want to take a look at Numberfire Premium, which helps you with daily fantasy and sports betting, use promo code CHAMPION and get your first month of any premium package for just $9.99. That's a cost savings of $40. Just head to numberfire.com/premium for more details. I'm going to kick things off at quarterback, and I'll talk about someone who I think is sort of an obvious buy this offseason, and that's Baker Mayfield. After so much promise during his rookie year, Baker, with better weapons and a new coaching staff, he was pretty bad in 2019. He was the QB 20 in total points, and that was even worse on a points per game basis. But since this is an episode about buying players, let me at least explain some of the reasons to not overstate what happened this past year with Baker Mayfield. First off, he faced a tough schedule, a really tough one. His schedule-adjusted fantasy numbers aren't very strong, but according to Numberfire's expected points model, he had the second toughest pass defense schedule in the league this year. There's also some regression that should hit Mayfield. Based on his passing yardage total, he should have had about 2 more touchdowns than he actually had this year. That's just me looking at how many yards it took for a quarterback to throw a touchdown over the last 9 years, or since 2011. Yards correlate to touchdowns, so it's an easy way to spot regression. Baker's number wasn't on like Phillip Rivers or Jared Goff's level, because they really underperformed in the touchdown column. But it's at least something to grab hold of and say that he underperformed this year mathematically. You can even see that with his 4.1% touchdown rate, which is just the number of touchdowns divided by the number of attempts that a quarterback throws. That was below the league average from 2019, which was 4.4%. Maybe Baker's just an average quarterback. Even if that's the case, there's some positive regression coming. But he was also a really good prospect, one of the best statistically that we've seen. And we saw him look a lot better fantasy-wise during his rookie year. So I'm buying the fact that regression will hit, that the schedule should get a little bit easier, and that maybe with a new coaching staff, Baker becomes a more efficient passer. He's certainly got the weapons to do it. A lower key buy that I like is someone that I mentioned on last week's mailbag show, and that's Matthew Stafford. Making fun of Matthew Stafford's age has kind of been a thing in fantasy circles since he entered the league, but it's nuts that Stafford's still only going to be 32 years old next year. He should have at least a few more years in the league, even if it's not all in Detroit. But at least in 2020, given his contract situation, he'll be in Detroit. And that's a good thing. I do think his injury has seemed to really overshadow what he accomplished this year. Because Stafford was really good. On a points per game basis, only Lamar Jackson, Deshaun Watson, and Dak Prescott was better than Matthew Stafford. Stafford's yards per attempt was 8.6, which was by far the highest number of his career. At least a portion of this can be related to a shift in offensive coordinator to Darrell Bevell. Like I said on the mailbag show last week, Stafford threw it deep at the highest rate of his career in 2019, and he had his second highest completion percentage on those types of throws. And I don't think that the market has really caught up to this. According to Dynasty League Football's January startup average draft position data, Stafford's listed at QB 19. I understand the ranking and why he's listed there, but you can make the argument, and I basically just made it, but you can make the argument that he's got more short-term upside than players ahead of him like Kirk Cousins, Drew Brees, and Jimmy Garoppolo. I'm very much a fan of just going through the aged veterans at quarterback in Dynasty because you can generally get them for a really cheap price tag in single quarterback leagues. And that's the logic with Stafford. He has top 10 upside very easily next season given what he did in 2019. And you can feel pretty good about the weapons that he has around him in the short term as well. He's a nice veteran to target. Buying running backs is generally a tough thing to do in Dynasty. There are only maybe like 10 to 12 running backs you can feel confident will give you workhorse numbers for more than one season. And that might even be an optimistic view. So on this show each year, I rarely have a ton of running back picks. But one younger player who I think is slightly undervalued right now when looking at startup ADP is Devin Singletary. Entering last year's draft, I wasn't the biggest fan of Singletary given his size. We don't have a large sample of players at his size really succeeding at the NFL level, especially when you combine it with his 4.66 speed. Fortunately, that speed isn't a death sentence, and the 40 is really about hitting that 4.7 threshold. But the combination of it all made Singletary a risky prospect, despite good college production. The way I viewed Singletary changed a bit when he was drafted, given that draft capital is really important for running backs for fantasy purposes. And then I watched him play at the NFL level, and he was really good. So my opinion flipped, which is what can and should happen when you're presented with new information. Singletary was banged up during the early parts of the 2019 season, but even on a points per game basis, he finished as a higher end RB3. He wasn't anything special from a fantasy standpoint. He was fine with some random spiked weeks. But a big part of Singletary's lack of fantasy production was touchdown related. He scored just twice despite having 775 yards on the ground. Using the yards to touchdowns conversion since 2011, running backs have typically scored well over 5 touchdowns with that type of yardage total. When you factor in his receiving, Singletary underperformed in the touchdown column based on his yards by over 2. You might be saying, well, yeah, he didn't see goal line work and the Bills have Josh Allen to steal rushing touchdowns from him. This is true. Singletary only had 2 goal line rushes last year, and Josh Allen had 9 rushing touchdowns after scoring 8 the previous year. But this is also sort of the point. You can get Singletary at a mid RB2 price right now, when that's not even that far off from where he ranked during his rookie year. And that was on a team that didn't feature him as the goal line back, that saw rushing touchdowns go to their quarterback, and that ranked 24th in the NFL in total offensive touchdowns scored. All of those things can easily bounce in Singletary's favor as early as next season. He could see more goal line work. Josh Allen's rushing touchdown number could regress. And the Bills, if they add more weapons, can be a lot more effective offensively. And all the while, you've got a running back who's going to be 23 in November and who will almost definitely be the starter in Buffalo for the next 3 years. So to me, Singletary is someone who's probably properly priced because of the running back landscape in general, but of the younger players in that range, he's my favorite to target. Now, when you look at the running back position in Dynasty, it's really, really top heavy. Like I said earlier, there's only like a dozen or so backs who you really feel confident about, and maybe 20 of them who are locked in for a nice workload next season and beyond. Maybe. So when you dig deep at the position, you're really just trying to tell yourself a story about a path to relevancy. If you look at DynastyLeagueFootball.com's ADP data, any running back past like RB30 needs a story. He needs something to break in his favor for him to take off. Now, I was actually planning on talking about Damian Williams here. And I think Williams is still sort of a galaxy brain type of buy right now. But he did what he did in the playoffs, and his price is probably going to change as a result. It wouldn't be a bad idea to at least see how easy it would be to get him this offseason, because there's still a chance that Williams ends up as the RB1 in Kansas City next year. We said the same thing this year, I get it, but it did come to fruition eventually. So I don't think it's a bad idea to try to buy him. He's one of the lower tiered running backs that you could potentially target. But the one that I want to bring up today is Justice Hill. Now, admittedly, this sort of goes against what I talked about on last week's show, since I preached that good fantasy assets were generally productive as rookies. And that's still true. But you can't just easily find productive rookie running backs who are priced low. That's why you need a story. And the story with Justice Hill is that he's got an aging running back in front of him on the depth chart. He was a fairly productive running back at the college level. He plays in one of the most explosive offenses in the league, and he has one of the best young quarterbacks in the league. And he's a freak athlete. The expectation for Hill probably shouldn't be that he's going to be a workhorse. You're not necessarily buying Hill to be a top 10 running back. But Gus Edwards is a free agent right now. In 2019, Edwards handled 34% of Baltimore's running back rushes, and he saw 133 carries. There's a world where he doesn't get re-signed, and Baltimore features more of a 1-2 punch with Mark Ingram and Justice Hill. And despite limited playing time, Hill still had about a 3.5% target share in that Baltimore offense. He's going to need a much higher percentage there on a run-heavy team to be relevant. But the point is that Edwards played more than double the number of snaps, but Hill had about double the number of targets. So the potential loss of Edwards could get Hill on the field more, which could increase both his attempt and target share. Basically what I'm saying here is Justice Hill won't necessarily just play a Gus Edwards type role. In fact, he probably won't because they're not the same type of back. So the upside with Hill is that he's potentially an injury away from being the RB1 in one of the best situations for a running back in fantasy football. The downside is that he never really gets going. The Ravens keep Gus Edwards around, and we just see a little bit more volume for him in year 2 and moving forward. But you can get Hill for a pretty cheap price, and that makes the upside piece worthwhile. And for the record, there have been some backs who have succeeded after rookie seasons like Justice Hill just had. A good career arc comp, or a positive comp, might be someone like Tevin Coleman. Except Coleman was just a superior prospect. I find wide receiver analysis in Dynasty the most intriguing, because when you hit on one of them, that player can give you production for a really long period of time. Now, having anchors at running back is important, and you're still gaining the same type of edge that you are in redraft if you have someone like Christian McCaffrey. But because there's a lot more depth at wide receiver, you can go in a lot of different directions with how you want to build the position. I've got 4 wide receiver buys for you today, and the first one is Michael Gallup. According to DLF's January ADP data, Gallup is listed at wide receiver 27. He's behind Tyler Boyd and Adam Thielen, when I would take Michael Gallup over both of those guys. Let me give you a little side-by-side comparison here. Player A, a wide receiver, he played all 16 games in 2019. On a per-game basis, he averaged 4.9 receptions, 74.3 receiving yards, and half a touchdown per game. That was good for 15.4 PPR points per game. Player A, that player, will be 26 years old in June. Player B is going to be 24 next month. And in 2019, he averaged 4.7 receptions per game, so 0.2 receptions fewer than Player A. He averaged 79 receiving yards per game, which was 5 more than Player A. And he scored about 0.4 touchdowns per game, which was really close to Player A's 0.5 rate. While Player A averaged 15.4 PPR points per game, Player B averaged 15.2. Based on this information alone, who would you rather have on your Dynasty roster? Nearly identical per game production, but one dude is 2 years younger. You'd likely go with Player B. Player B is Michael Gallup. Player A is Amari Cooper. Michael Gallup, like I said, was the wide receiver 27 in January startup ADP. Amari Cooper was wide receiver 10. Yes, I get it. Context is needed. Don't tilt too hard after hearing all of that. Cooper wasn't completely healthy all season long, so it's not the fairest comparison in the world. But I do think it speaks to how undervalued Michael Gallup is right now. He's in a much more pass-friendly offense than he was during his rookie year, and he's got a really good young quarterback throwing him passes. And Amari Cooper might not even be a Cowboy next year. That would make Michael Gallup the number 1 in this offense. I genuinely don't understand why someone would want Adam Thielen or Tyler Boyd over Michael Gallup. And you can make the same argument for a lot of guys ahead of him, like Tyler Lockett. I mean, think of it this way. Adam Thielen hit Michael Gallup's year 2 points per game mark just once in his career. Same with Tyler Boyd. Lockett has never done it. And all of those guys are substantially older than Michael Gallup. So if the person with Gallup in your league is truly valuing him like a mid-range or a high-end wide receiver 3, which is where his ADP is, I would be trying to get him. Curtis Samuel is sort of an obvious buy candidate. A lot of people, including myself to a degree, we were into him entering the 2019 season. It was going to be his breakout year. But that didn't exactly happen, and I do think that quarterback play was a pretty big reason for it. Because Samuel had strong peripherals in 2019. He saw almost 18% of Carolina's targets, and he had an absurd number of air yards. According to airyards.com, Curtis Samuel was 9th in the NFL at wide receiver in air yards, but he ranked 51st in receiving yards. That has positive regression written all over it. Things went poorly for Samuel on deep balls this year. We saw 79 wide receivers with 50 or more targets in 2019, and Samuel ranked 18th in percentage of targets seen that traveled 15 or more air yards. About 35% of his targets went 15 or more yards through the air. Now, among this same group, among those 79 wide receivers, Samuel was second worst in catch rate on those throws, ahead of only Deshaun Hamilton. And he was 49th in receiving yards on those throws. Some may say that this is a bad sign for Samuel because maybe he's just not very good. But targets are a talent statistic. If he's being targeted, that means he's probably open. And if you want to place blame on some of those numbers, wouldn't it make more sense to blame the backup quarterback as opposed to the guy who entered the league as a much better prospect? With everything changing in Carolina, I'm bullish on this offense in general. And Samuel's a cheap enough way at wide receiver 39 in startups to get a piece of it. It seems like people aren't giving Diontae Johnson enough love for what he did during his rookie season. With arguably the worst quarterback situation in all of football this year, Johnson put up 680 receiving yards, 5 touchdowns, and he saw almost 19% of Pittsburgh's targets. His target share actually ranked 16th highest among all rookie wide receivers since 2011. And to reiterate, targets are a skill statistic. Everything should get better for Pittsburgh moving forward. Not only could Johnson just develop as a player, but Pittsburgh's getting Ben Roethlisberger back. In the 5 years prior to 2019, the Steelers averaged 44.6 touchdowns per season. This past year, they scored 25 times on offense. That tied the Jets for the lowest number in the league. Now, a lot of people may be on James Washington too, and I think that's fine. Washington's ADP is about 5 spots lower than Johnson's, but I prefer Johnson despite the fact that Washington was the superior prospect in my model. This is not a situation like a Dante Pettis and Deebo Samuel that I talked about a couple of weeks ago on the show. With Deebo, we didn't know what we were getting, and he was a better prospect coming out than Pettis was. With James Washington and Diontae Johnson, we have an NFL sample for both players. And Diontae Johnson's rookie season with trash quarterback play was essentially as good as what we saw from James Washington during year 2. I'm fine with buying both guys, but I do prefer Johnson by a decent margin. His season really seems to be undervalued at his current wide receiver 44 price tag. You can usually buy non-elite veteran wide receivers at a discount. Marvin Jones is wide receiver 51 right now in startups, even though he was a top 20 wide receiver in points per game this past year. But Julian Edelman is another player who falls into that bucket. Edelman's coming off a 100 reception season where he ranked as a top 10 wideout in PPR scoring. But he's listed at wide receiver 46 because he's going to be 34 years old in May. Is his age a problem? Yeah, it's a problem from the perspective that he could retire tomorrow. But he's past the traditional age when we see wide receiver production take a nosedive. Basically, it's pretty safe to say that Julian Edelman isn't your traditional wide receiver. Only Jerry Rice, Larry Fitzgerald, Reggie Wayne, and Derek Mason have had a 100 reception season at 33 years of age or older. Our sample size of a wide receiver being this productive at this age is very small. So saying Julian Edelman is old, that holds a lot less weight than saying something like T.Y. Hilton is getting older. The thing with Edelman that's kind of interesting right now too is that Tom Brady's status is still kind of up in the air. If you're a believer like I am that Brady's going to stay put in New England, but maybe the person in your league with Edelman is not a believer, then Edelman might be able to be bought at a discount. He's the perfect type of veteran to acquire though. He's already shown that he's an outlier, so age matters a little bit less. He's really, really cheap production. The last player I want to talk about today is a tight end, and it's Jace Sternberger. College production and how it translates matters a lot less at tight end than it does at wide receiver and running back. At least that's what I've found. But it's hard to ignore Sternberger's 92nd percentile dominator rating, which is courtesy of playerprofiler.com. And then athleticism seems to matter a little bit more at tight end than the other positions, and he tested as an above average athlete. But I'm really buying Jace Sternberger because of what the market is showing us right now. He's listed at tight end 24 in that January startup data. That's far behind players like Chris Herndon and Gerald Everett. It's kind of crazy when Sternberger is on a team that's really lacking pass-catching options, they have good quarterback play, and it's a team where the starting tight end is 34 years old and often looks like a dad runner. Jimmy Graham's not expected to be on the team next year according to the Green Bay Press-Gazette. Sternberger was a 75th overall pick in 2019. Who do we think is going to step in and replace Jimmy Graham? You could honestly remove talent and remove any positive feelings that you have about Jace Sternberger. Remove them. Look solely at the opportunity in front of him. That opportunity alone shows a player who should be higher than a low-end tight end 2 in fantasy football. You're really just playing the market here. Now, before I let you guys go, I want to say one thing. Your consideration set for players that you're buying should be large. There are lots and lots of players who are going to score fantasy points for you. These are just some that I like most, that I think are undervalued. But you should have an open mind and be cool with targeting a lot of different players. Selling players at the right time is always a more important exercise, and I'll be covering that next week. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you get subscribed to Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks, everyone. I'll be back in your ear later this week with the Mailbag Show.